Hello, hello everyone. Thank you all for joining this webinar on Africa Day. I am Andrea Chamorro, analyst of Alternative Foundation, and today I have the honor of sharing this space with two exceptional speakers. Joaquín Tasso, European Ambassador of European Union to Mauritania, and Ndongo Samba Silla, Senegalese economist, specialist in development. Good morning for both, and thank you for your participation.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
To start this webinar, I want to have a little context about the African debt. And the first question is for the Professor Samba Silla. And I want to ask, how was African public debt evolved to the 2002 today?
Okay. Thank you for this question. Africa has been subjected to debt cycles. In fact, from the 1980s, there had been an international debt crisis, and this affected the African continent. During that period, let's say 1980 to 2000, we had structural adjustment programs, meaning that the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank would submit the African continent to, austerity policies, liberalization policies, so as to try to tackle the debt problem, foreign debt problem. But this did not work because when you look at the data, in fact, the level of foreign debt, in comparison to African GDP was the same, as in the 2000. So the African foreign debt only decreased when, there was debt cancellations. There were two initiatives: the HIPIC, heavily indebted poor countries, and also the multilateral debt relief initiative. And from there, in mid 2000, the foreign debt decreased a lot for many African countries. You see, but just after, there was also reconstitution of African debt. So African debt also increased between 2005, let's say, and 2020. Now the situation is that, before, African debt used to be, owed to, let's say, to Europeans to some extent, Europeans, and also financial institutions controlled by Europeans. But now that is not the case. I could quote here data coming from the World Bank. The World Bank every year issues a report called International Debt Report. And for the 2024 report, you could see that for sub-Saharan Africa, the public and publicly guaranteed foreign debt was 500 billion USD, public and publicly guaranteed. And 41% was owed to private creditors, meaning bondholders, 26%, and other commercial creditors, 14%. After the private creditors, you have the multilateral creditors, 40%. And this was owed to World Bank, 19%, IMF, 7%, and other multilaterals, 14%. So the third creditors are the bilateral creditors. That means the governments. And you could see that the first bilateral creditor of Africa is China, 11%. And after that, you have France, 2%. The others are 6%. So the composition is 41% private creditors, 40% multilateral creditors, and 90% bilateral creditors. And the debt service, that means the payments, annual payments to service the debt, were estimated at 46 billion USD in 2023. So that means that the debt is heavy for African countries, but for the global system, it's really nothing. And I could give you just one example. The public debt of the Netherlands alone is higher than the public debt stock, public foreign debt stock of the sub-Saharan African as a whole.
Thank you very much. European Union has been historically been one of the African main financial partners. How is its role evaluated today as a contributing to sustainability or the worsening of Africa debt? If you can answer in this question both, because I think it's interesting contrast the ideas. Ambassador Tasso, please.
Thank you very much, Andrea. I would like also to thank you and Fundación Alternativas for the UCAN invitation to have me here today exchanging with Mr. Sambasila and with yourself on the question of African debt. I will start with a disclaimer. I will not be speaking today as an EU ambassador on behalf of the EU, but on my private capacity, which gives me a little bit more freedom, if you will. So that's important. Let me also start with the basics. I mean, the debt itself is not necessarily bad. It can actually be an excellent financing mechanism that allows countries to make productive investments, and even having a high ratio of debt to GDP is not necessarily unsustainable. Many, as you know, industrialized economies have very high ratios of debt to GDP, higher than African countries, and they are, however, not exposed to the same risks and vulnerabilities. Why? Because the sustainability of the debt depends on many other economic and financial variables, notably the growth rate, but also, of course, the interest rate, which is a major issue for Africa. So that's one of the issues that we could discuss later. As you mentioned, yes, indeed, Europe is one of Africa's main financial partners, even if today it only accounts for between 20 or 25% of Africa's external debt. It depends on how you count it, and I think Mr. Sambasila has already referred to that. And that's well below China, which accounts for double that share in current US dollar. But then we go to the question: what has been the role of Europe in promoting debt relief? And I think it has been fundamental. If you look at the past 30 years, most of the international initiatives aimed at reducing African debt burden have been somehow promoted or initiated or championed by Europe. From the heavily indebted poor country initiatives and the multilateral debt relief initiatives, which started even, I think, 1995, something like that, to the different Paris Club bilateral processes, the G20 measures during the COVID era, which are important, notably the debt service suspension and the more ambitious G20 common framework, and of course all the United Nations Financing for Development conference. Beyond these multilateral initiatives, the EU, and by the EU I mean the institutions, the member state, also the European Investment Bank, provides, as you know, concessional finance grants, sometimes in the form of blending, mixing, grants with concessional finance, which are usually accompanied by technical assistance, debt for nature, climate swaps, which all of them are already measures free fiscal space that can be used to invest in social services and other. Let's look at, I think we can look at how this has evolved in the last years. When you look at the impact of the highly indebted poor countries initiative and the multilateral debt reduction initiative, despite their massive volume, I think today when we look back, the impact has been disappointing. That's the word I would like to use. I mean, we saw that I think if I'm not mistaken, around 35, 36 African countries were beneficiaries of these initiatives, and almost all of them, they saw large post-relief falls in their debt to GDP ratios. But only a handful of them, and I can mention probably Tanzania, Uganda, and to a certain extent Benin come to mind, they managed to keep their debt levels under control. While many others, and including Zambia, Ghana, Mozambique, Ethiopia, Cameroon, they are again today classified by the IMF as the world as being at high risk or already in debt distress. But I think the question we have to ask ourselves is why? Why some African countries manage to keep their debt levels under control after benefiting from these large-scale debt reduction schemes, while others have again indebted themselves to unsustainable levels? And I believe that the answer to that question has little to do with Europe or with the creditors, and more to the way that these countries have managed their economy and the level of economic governance that they have. I am aware, Andrea, that your question was about the role of the EU, but I think it's also important that we stop somehow taking responsibility away from African governments, and that we question the role of the African governments in contributing to the sustainability or to the worsening of African debt. And I think if you look now at the main reasons why African countries have unsustainable levels of debt today, we can clearly see that they are largely the result of their own government's decisions. Let me mention just the four main reasons why these countries are in debt again. Well, most of them, they have borrowed clearly excessively for infrastructure and other investments that sometimes were questionable, such as some of these industrial parks and public works that serve sometimes more the interest of the lender than the interest of the borrower. They have been largely relying on Chinese lender and non-concessional commercial loans, as well as on issuing, hard currency bonds that were, very difficult to repay afterwards. These countries have recurrent fiscal deficit. They have been unable.
Ambassador Tasso,
Yeah.
that's very interesting that you have, if you can conclude, because there are so many.
Yes, that's my last. It was my last point. The third reason was the fiscal deficit that they are undergoing. They are unable to do proper fiscal reform. And the last one, and I finish here, has been overall poor governance and transparency failures. And I think the case of the secret loans that were backed by state guarantees in Mozambique, I think is the most unfortunate example. I stop here because I'm aware that I have already exceeded my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Professor Sambasila, would you like to add something?
Yeah, maybe just also to try to analyze also the reasons for African debt. Surely there are responsibilities coming from African governments, but I think the problem is structural because debt crises happen in cycles. So that means it's not one or two countries, but many global South countries, African, Latin American countries, and Asian countries. And I think this is linked with the way the international monetary and financial system works. Now you could have aggravating factors coming from, economic mismanagement and so on. But I think the basic problem explaining the recurrence of debt crisis is the fact that we are living in a system which requires, countries in the periphery, let's say the countries that have, peripheral currencies to meet their external obligations in hard currency. I think that is the source of the problem of the debt crisis. If we had another economic system, financial system, that allows countries to buy their imports in their own currencies, we would not have debt crisis. But we are not in that system. We are in a system called a key fiat currency system. So that means that except for Europe and the US, most other countries have to accumulate US dollar or euros in order to pay for their import, pay for their debts. That is, I think, the main structural constraint that could be aggravated by, economic mixed behavior or things like that.
Okay. Thank you. And for the next question, that's important to say the last summer, the Seville conference took place, and it was very focused in the development after the withdrawal of American aid of development. And I want to answer both. What assessment can be made of the Seville conference in relation to African demands for debt relief and restructuring? Professor Sambasila, please.
Okay, thank you. Recently, during the summer this year, we had this fourth UN conference on financing for development. There were high expectations, not only from Africa, but what we call now the global South. One major demand has been a UN convention for restructuring, sovereign debts. This has been a long-term demand coming from the global South. At that time, we call this third world. Since the foundation of the UNCTAD in the mid-1960s, they had this demand. How could we have a functional mechanism that allows an orderly restructuring of foreign debts, incurred by the countries in the global South? sovereign debt restructuring mechanism that would preserve, output and employment. But, across the decades, there have been, a resistance from creditor countries, I mean, the US, Europe, for such a convention. And in Sevilla, that was also the case. In fact, people were expecting that because we saw that, they had, with the COVID-19, there had been some initiatives. Ambassador Tasso talked about the debt service distribution initiatives. There was also the common framework. But you see, many countries also did not grow so the common framework, despite the fact that they were objectively in the situation of debt distress, you see. And some of them even feared that going into these schemes could give a bad signal to the international capital markets, and they wanted to have access to capital markets. So all of these issues were not solved, at the Sevilla Conference on Financing for Development, because there was nothing binding that resulted mostly from this conference. So what happened was that the creditor countries, developed countries, would just try to help, developing countries would try also to invest in developing countries through blended finance. That means a mix of private funding and also public funding. Those were basically the outcomes. It was not a surprise, but it was disappointing in the sense that most governments from the Global South were expecting something, up to the challenges of today, because we have a serious global debt crisis, in most of the Global South, and these are not addressed currently speaking.
Ambassador Tasso, would you like to add something?
Yes, of course. But let me. I really need to come back to the previous question and the point made by Professor Sambasila when he believes that the main reason for this high level of debt today is actually he's putting the blame on the financial system and on the fact that these countries have to borrow in hard currency. And I would say, yeah, it does have an impact, and it would be good to have systems in which we can promote, local currency borrowing, but that's not the main reason. And I think I have already explained. And also, and the reason why we can demonstrate that is that some African countries did manage to sustainably reduce the debt levels. So that proves that the problem was not on the financial architecture or on the fact that the debt was in hard currency, but the problem was that some countries did have better economic governance than others. So that's just coming back to that point. Now, on the outcome of the Sevillian conference, well, I think overall it's a positive outcome, and that some of the concrete proposals that were made, and I'm referring in particular to for instance, the disaster clauses on debt suspension, even if they are not always automatic, or the call to scale up this debt for climate or debt for nature traps, the debt clause mechanism in case of economic shocks, etc. They are all steps in the right direction. I have no doubt. Personally, I would have liked to see more ambitious measures, such as I think we need enforceable rules for comparable treatment across creditors, which that's a main issue today, and the mechanism to force private sector participation and to compel non-Paris Club members, and of course I'm referring here to China, to meet these common standards. That would have been, I would say, my ideal and preferred outcome. I do not, however, believe that unconditional debt cancellations across the board, as was called for by some civil society organizations, will be. I believe it will be both unfair, if you want, and counterproductive. But there's no need to elaborate on that, I think. Thank you.
Thank you both. And in relation to that question, I want to ask to the Professor Sambasila about the consequence of the economic debt, because it's a great unknown for the general public, and I want to ask how does the debt affect to the economic sovereignty and the capacity to African states to design and implement their own public and autonomous economy?
Yeah, in fact, when we talk about debt, we have to make sure to distinguish, let's say, debt in domestic currency versus debt in foreign currency. Because debt in itself is not bad. You need debt for your own development. You see, you need debt. So it depends how you use that debt and what are the conditions of sustainability attached to it. In the case of the debt in domestic currency, you need that. And if you look at, heterodox economists know, for example, that, the state deficit, that means when the state spends more than it receives in terms of taxes, non-taxes income, this creates financial wealth for the private sector, you see. And this is also a source, the deficit is a source of profits, one of the source of profits for the capitalist class. Let's put it like that, you see. So debt in itself is not bad. But now, when you have a control over the interest rates, for example, you borrow in your own currency, and the central bank has a control on the interest rate. So the central bank could make sure that the interest rates on government bonds are lower than the nominal GDP growth. If the central bank does that, your debt could be sustainable. That means you don't have any issue, to repay your debt, etc. But the thing is, with foreign debt is different, because you have different foreign debts. You could have concessional ones. You could have also bonds, issued in international capital markets. And African countries have been persuaded to issue bonds in international capital markets, because what happened? It's after the 2008, 2009, global financial crisis. So there was, unconventional monetary policies in the global north, quantitative easing, zero interest rate policies. So you have, large amounts of liquidity, available in international capital markets. And those liquidities were partly, invested in what was called, emerging markets. And so many African countries issued, for example, Euro bonds. That means debt denominated in foreign currencies, bond denominated in foreign currencies. And sometimes, they could land, up to 9% a year, 10%. And this is not sustainable at all when you do that. And that means that African countries have to be very vigilant when it comes, to issuing debts in foreign currency, you see. And that could be a problem. There have been some countries which managed, to maintain, a reasonable level of foreign debt, because generally those countries are creditor countries in the sense that they used to have, trade surpluses and current account external surpluses. And so these countries, they do not need to issue, bonds in foreign currency. You could take, for example, the case of Botswana. It's one of the richest African countries. It's a diamond exporter. And you could see that Botswana never issued a bond in foreign currency. Most of the external financing comes from the World Bank and the African Development Bank, for example, mostly. None come from Europe in terms of debt, for example, you see. So that means that we have to be very, very careful. And generally, countries like Zambia and Ghana, I think we talked about them. The issue is not only with foreign debt, but also the lack of control over the extractive sectors. I did the calculations myself, but when you take Zambia and Ghana, their debts were canceled. It was more than one foreign debt. It was more than 110 for Zambia and Ghana. And by 2006, it was less than 10% of their gross national income. But 50 years later, the debt reconstituted. Not to that levels, but at least it reconstituted, and those countries defaulted 2020 for Zambia. What happened in the meantime is that they had a commodity boom, but these countries did not benefit of the commodity boom because they have no control over the extractive sectors. So when you see what were repatriated as profits and dividends, that was generally twice higher than the external debt service, despite the high rates on those external debts. You see, so that means that for African countries, it's not only about the debt, because African countries could generate themselves their own financing if they had a better control over their extractive sectors. But simply that's not the case. So basically, yeah, debt in domestic currency generally does not generate any problem, because if you look at, for example, the rich countries, Japan has a level of debt to GDP ratio more than 200%. Japan will never be insolvent because most of the debt is in Japanese currency and most of the debt is held by the central bank itself. That's not the case of African countries, which accumulate debt in foreign currencies. And I think debt in foreign currencies if it's not used widely, issued widely, could be problematic.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very interesting because as far as I know, the control of interest rate and the natural resource is becoming an increasingly demand. For example, in Senegal and other countries, is a very interesting topic, and it will be a very debate topic in the future. So,
I think those are two important issues: interest rates on foreign bond denominated in foreign currency, and control over extractive export income. Those are the key, I would say, the key determinants of African financial sovereignty.
Thank you. And for the Ambassador Tasso, it's time to speak to the Seville conference and the relation to European Union. And if we can speak of a new European commitment to warfare and a structural debris for Africa.
Yeah, thank you very much. On the consequences, if I may add, I largely subscribe what Mr. Sambasila was saying. But first of all, let's remind that the consequence of having unsustainable debt, in the sense that they have to devote, the public resources to repaying the debt instead of investing this money in what is very much needed, investments in social expenditure and in development overall. So that it is a very, very concrete and very, very serious impact. Again, I don't think it is possible to talk of Africa as a whole. We say, oh, Africa this and Africa that, because the realities are very different. And as Sambasila pointed to the case of Botswana, which is of course very different than other countries. The question of, can we blame the instrument the instrument for the problem? I would be prudent, because, as I mentioned, some countries did not do this, and they were more prudent, if you want, in the level of debt they incur. So again, I think it's more about political decisions made by African governments more than the difficulties or the implications of the financing instrument, which I do think, and I on that I agree, that this getting borrowing in hard currency is not an ideal mechanism, has negative consequences. The problem whether is we would like to see local currency borrowing, but is that actually how we do that, how we put it into place? We could talk about that. But now, coming to your question now on European commitment. There was, if I understand, there is a commitment. I think I already mentioned that the commitment is proved by the fact that Europe has been the one putting forward all these relief measures in the past, which did considerably, it managed to considerably reduce the debt burden of many African countries, at least for a while, as I mentioned. At the conference in Seville, and I think the EU and its member states, they champion many of the commitments made in the outcome document, like I mentioned the disaster clauses before on debt suspension, these swaps and the debt post mechanism in case of but more importantly, I think EU member states and EU institutions, including the European Investment Bank, they made substantial announcements. And I think one of the best is this commitment to reallocate, I think, $100 billion worth of SDRs, special drawing rights, for the relief conversions of debt into development projects and initiatives to tie relief to climate resilience and to climate resilience in investment. These are important measures. But I would like to stress that these commitments in Seville, they complement, to a certain extent, the G20 common framework, which is today the most, I would say, promising or ambitious, that despite all the delays and difficulties, is still the most ambitious debt restructuring initiative, which is currently in place, and which, unlike former initiatives, it does include China and it does include commercial banks. So this G20 common framework will not have been possible without the political leadership and engagement of Europe within the G20. So that's I think that demonstrates what has been the commitment of the European Union in Seville and in general on debt relief today.
Yeah, because that's important because European Union has many interests in West Africa, like as migration control, security, or fight against climate change. How do you think that agendas intersect with the debt relief policy?
Differently, I think. Well, one very clear is climate change. We are all aware that climate shocks could be, major floods or droughts, or they are a major driver of what we call debt stress. And in Seville and in other frameworks, we have explicitly pushed for these clauses on debt suspension in case of disasters, including climate disasters, and for the conversion of debt into development projects that fight climate change. And the European Union is also, the main supporter of the UN Green Bonds initiatives. These are, these are debt securities where the proceeds are earmarked for projects benefiting the environment, renewable energies, energy efficiency, biodiversity, climate adaptation, etc. So for climate change, it's very clear. It is intentional. It is explicit, and it is how do you say? Actually, one of there is a direct link. I don't see direct links, however, between debt relief efforts and Europe's migration and security policy, except, of course, I would say for the proposed debt pause in case of conflict. So if there is a conflict, we can consider, stopping for a while the repayment of the debt. I think maybe I would like to be a little bit provocative here, that a stronger link between debt relief and security cooperation may actually be a good thing. Particularly if we consider the devastating impact that insecurity and conflict have not only on the country's economy but also on its population, and particularly the most vulnerable. I have myself worked in Yemen, in the Sahel, and in other conflict-affected regions, and I'm today convinced that if we had invested in security and in conflict prevention, maybe more than we did in development, we could have been able to promote development more effectively and human rights. So it's not, I would say, crystal clear, however. The case of migration is also different. Debt relief and investments are sometimes maybe presented as they contribute to reduce the drivers of irregular migration. But to be honest with you, these are often indistinguishable from development objectives. I mean, what are these projects doing? What are we doing with the trust fund for migration? These are projects that are targeting poverty, unemployment, poor education, the lack of public services. They consist of technical and vocational training for the youth, for job creation, institutional capacity building. So I think it's more a question of how you label them and then on the substance of the project, because I have seen exactly the same project in one country, vocational training for the youth, educational training. In one case was funded under a development instrument, and another one was funded under a migration management system. So it's exactly the same thing. But maybe we should start, overcoming this what I consider a naive idea that development and by extension debt relief should be some kind of pure and selfish and not contaminated, by other policies. I mean, development does not take place in a vacuum. In the real world, development, governance, security, migration, security, climate change, these are closely intertwined. And I believe, argue, and since Fundación Alternativas is a progressive think tank, that doing so is not progressive, and that ignoring security concerns not only undermines development, but also causes tremendous human suffering. So more complicated picture that it may look like, and I would say different ways in which the migration, the climate change, and the security policy interact or are intersect with the debt relief efforts. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Sambasira, would you like to add something?
Oh, not really, but maybe to say that security issues are very important in the sense that, I mean, if you don't have a framework for peace, it will be difficult to have lasting achievements. But I think for that, in Africa, at least, we need a form of Pan-African, solution to our security issues. That's really important. And if we could have the, I mean, sincere help coming from external actors, bilateral partners, or institutions like the EU, that would be welcome. But the thing is that, for example, if we look at what has been happening in the Sahel in terms of uh, security approach, this has to some extent disrupted, the way African, for example, conceives of, migration, their migration policies within Africa. And these are unfortunate developments, that have to be, avoided, I would say, because the EU policy, when it comes, to migration, has been to some extent to extend its borders to some extent within Africa to say that African countries have themselves to prevent migration coming from Africa. I mean, illegal migration coming from Africa, going to Europe, etc. And this is not the type of approach that would be ideal for a true partnership between African countries and the EU.
Thank you. And the next question is for you, and in my opinion, one of the most important question in this webinar. That's from Africa perspective. What do governments and civil society expect from Europe's role in deep relief?
Well, as I said earlier, in terms of bilateral relationship, Europe is not the major creditor to the African countries, at least sub-Saharan Africa. So what we would expect from Europe and also other partners, is, progress regarding what I would call the debt system, because there is a difference between the debt system and the debt stock. Because when we talk about debt relief or debt cancellation, it's, for example, saying, oh, in 2023, the public and public guaranteed debt of Southern Africa is 500 billion USD. We want to cancel part of it or, substantial part of it. So that's the thing. But providing debt relief or canceling that could be really helpful. And I think many African countries should have already been into default, because what they have been paying as, debt service is much too high compared, to their, to their needs. For example, many countries, spend more, on debt service than, for example, on health, on education, etc. So that's not normal. But the thing is, debt relief does not cancel the debt system. And by debt system, I mean all the structural conditions that put African countries into a form of debt trap. It's not specific to Africa. We could also have that in Latin America and Asian countries. So what is a debt system? I mean, the debt system is about, all these high costs of, foreign capital, for example. The fact that, African countries do not have control over their own extractive sectors. And I gave the case of Zambia and Ghana, which are really eloquent, And there's also the economic model, because if you have an economic model that is based, on foreign real resources, I mean, technologies, equipment coming from abroad, I mean, that could be an issue, a development issue, because at one point your debt will not be sustainable. What happened in many African countries is that they took these Euro bonds. I mean, they invested that in infrastructure projects that could have been useful. But the thing is that those infrastructure projects, they did not generate the hard currency needed to service those debts. So, for example, if you invest, in a toll, that could be good for the society. But the people who use the toll will pay in domestic currency. And so that means that that project in itself will not generate the hard currency needed to reimburse itself. And it does not have any direct, impact on, on the increase of your exports, you see. So that has been the pattern. That's why most of these countries who took Eurobonds, you would see that in a period of 10 years, their external debt service increased while their exports income, stayed at the same level, more or less, you see. So that is a structural issue. So that's why I think we need to be more, to be bolder in our ambitions in the sense that I still think that the main issue is the international monetary financial non-system. There are people who take non-system because in the 1944, when they had this Bretton Woods conference, there was a proposition saying that, oh, we could have another financial system where all countries would be able to trade, using their own currencies. And this would help us get rid of this debt crisis. That would have been possible, but that was not the option chosen, you see. And that's why we have two things, because we have one side is the debt crisis, the other side, you have surplus countries. Those surplus countries, like, for example, Botswana, you have China, etc. Those surplus countries, they accumulate US dollars that they have not been using. That's why when you look at the data, there is a good report by the UNCTAD called Topsy-Turvy World. That means the developing countries are transferring net wealth to the rest, to the rich world, because this is linked with the international monetary financial non-system. So when you are in a deficit, you will be impose structural adjustment policies, World Bank, IMF. When you are a surplus country, that means that you have deposits in dollars or in euros you have been not using for your own economic development. That is the reality of the international monetary financial non-system. So as long as we remain with this non-system, we will still have this debt crisis and these surplus countries not using, their full economic potential. So we have to have thinking at that level. And in saying that, I'm not asking African governments from their responsibilities, because their responsibility is to have a sound financial system, because economic development has to be financed mostly from, domestic resources, not only through taxes, but also through appropriate banking and financial system. So that is an internal challenge that has also to be solved by African countries. So we expect Europe and other partners to help us move towards a more functional international monetary and financial system that would avoid this debt crisis, that would avoid also the sustenance of, disequilibrium, in the sense that you have surplus countries and also deficit countries. That's an issue. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a very important question, because it was you asked the last question for this webinar, that it was what kind of financial partnership will be truly equitable between Africa and Europe. And I think the Ambassador Tasso could add something else if he wants.
To me?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. What a truly equitable financial partnership will look like, or should look like, I think. Well, I think it should be, first we need to look at what should be the principles of this. And I think that the principles should be from first of all, democratic accountability. And I think that's what there is no, maybe the fact that Botswana has been mentioned like a successful country, has not only to do with its diamond. Zimbabwe also has a lot of diamonds, but also with the fact that it's probably one of the most democratic countries in Africa, where there's more accountability. So that tell us something about the importance of promoting the democratic accountability. Secondly, transparency. I think we should require full disclosure of loan terms, warranties, creditor identities. People have avoided a lot of the mistrust that the hidden, I would say, the hidden debt of some African countries has created. The question I mentioned before of comparability and solidarity, all creditors, be it China, multilaterals, private bondholders, they should abide by comparable treatment rules in the restructuring. That is extremely important. There should be another principle, is what I call climate justice, in the sense that there should be a special treatment, be it debt relief or grants or concessional financing, for climate vulnerable countries that contributed little to historic emissions. I mean, the truth is that Africa is not responsible for the climate crisis and our emissions, but they are the ones who are paying most of the consequences. Another principle, which may be counterintuitive, is we need a stronger conditionality, or more conditionality on governance, more conditionality on social expenditure. I mean, the fact that we thought that by relieving, these countries from the debt burden will result in more social expenditure. Well, it not always was the case. It was spending in other things. So in that sense, we need more conditionality. And the sixth principle, I will call it fiscal fairness. It's not fiscal fairness. There is still a lot of space in African countries for revenue mobilization. I mean, fiscal revenue for mobilization. The rich in Africa do not pay taxes, and it will be unfair that workers who are less rich than the rich Africans are contributing more to the development and to the relief of the debt of African countries that their own African nationals who are not paying taxes. So we need to look also at the fiscal question. And then once that we have set the principles, then we can look into what instruments actually contribute more to this. Some of them have been mentioned. I mentioned the SDR reallocations, the concessional financing for climate adaptation, for health, for education, for critical infrastructures as well. The debt for development swaps I mentioned as well. The debt suspension clauses for conflicts, for crises, for natural disaster. But also, and on that I would agree with Mr. Samba Silva, the overall, governance of the international financial architecture, where we need to give, I would say, African institutions and African governments a stronger seats, if you want, at the table to shape this policy. That is very important. And the last one, which I already mentioned as well, is, and that will require a new discussion, is how can we promote altogether more local currency lending and support for domestic revenue mobilization. The local currency, I mean, would be ideal. But if a country decides now to issue, debt in local currency in African countries, I am afraid it will not attract a lot of interest. So we need to see how we can all contribute to change that and to make it attractive. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Professor Sambasila, would you like to add something else?
Yeah, maybe 2 quick points. First, about fiscal fairness. I think that's a good point, fiscal fairness. But I think fiscal fairness also should be enlarged to include the behavior of transnational companies coming from Europe, the US, China, etc. Because there had been many works done at the AU, African Union. There had been a high-level panel on illicit financial flows. And we see that African countries have been bleeded financially by, the accounting practices, of transnational companies. So if we could solve that problem, I mean, maybe Africa as a continent would be a creditor to the rest of the world. And so we would not be talking about debt crisis. This is an area where we need the cooperation from rich countries. But rich countries have tended to privilege their own interests. And that's why we did not make progress. I mean, the progress we expected on this issue. As I said, the AU has been working on that for decades. There had been a report 2015 by former South African President Thabo Mbeki on this issue of illicit financial flows. That's really important. So if we talk about fiscal fairness, we need to factor in that aspect. The other thing is about the climate. And here we have to be very lucid about what is possible. I always say we have to understand the international monetary and financial non-system we are living in. Because, if we ask the African countries, you have to transition to net zero, etc., you should not use your fossil fuels, etc., what will happen? Many countries will become debtor countries, I mean, structurally speaking, because there are many African countries who depend on the exports of their fossil fuels resources and other and also some minerals. So if these countries could no longer sell their fossil fuels, what will happen? I mean, they will be in a deficit position, and they will be, under, austerity policies from the IMF, etc. Because there would be no other sources of foreign finance. Because when it comes to finance, climate finance, I mean, it's just about more debt. There are no grants. Grants are limited compared to the needs. So that means that if we want to solve the climate crisis, we absolutely need another international monetary financial system. You can't ask countries to become more debtor, more deficit countries, because that would be the practical implication of trying to transit, to another model, unfortunately. And the dominant approach to climate has been what Professor Daniela Gabo has been calling Wall Street consensus. That means that you create opportunities for bankable projects coming from the global north, China, etc. So that will be reliant on the view that the state has no money, and so the climate has to be solved by private finance. And we don't think that this would be the good approach. We have to rehabilitate a public approach to climate issues. And to do that, for the countries in Africa and the global south, I think it's absolutely necessary that we have another financial system. Otherwise, it could not work, because you could not say that for everything you need, all the technologies, you have to buy them in hard currency. And the only way you could have the hard currency without that, generally speaking, is through the export of fossil fuels and also mineral, etc. See, so that's a very important issue, and people have to understand that this international monetary financial non-system could not allow any smooth, transition. Globally speaking, that would be fair for all. It could not. So we have to think very seriously about it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And with this last point, we have to conclude our webinar. Thank you all for following it. Thank you to the speakers for this amazing webinar. We have a lot of ideas which invite a deep reflection about the African debt and the role of European Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Thank you very
Thank
much.
You very much, and thank you, Ambassador Tasso.
Mr. Samba Silva, thank you, pleasure, and thank you to Fundación Alternativas. Bye-bye.